Well, the Denver Broncos, obviously, with a disappointing 2022-2023 season, and we're a bit more on A, recapping it, and B, looking ahead to perhaps some of the changes that they'll make. We're joined by the one, the only, our Broncos 9 News insider, Mike Klis, for a bit more on the Broncos and what to expect into the offseason and 2023 and perhaps beyond as well. Mike, thanks so much for joining us. First of all, I think it's safe to say the only way to summarize the season, disappointing, correct?
You could say disappointing. You could say abysmal. You can say horrific. You can say the worst season in Broncos history when you consider the expectations going in. They had some bad teams in the 60s, but they were supposed to be bad going in. This team was supposed to have a transformation season. They were supposed to turn it around. At the very least, get to the playoffs. You do not trade away 2 first-round draft picks and 2 second-round draft picks and give a quarterback $245 million extension and expect to go 4-12 as we sit here today. And you expect to go in the playoffs and even win a playoff game. I think the Elite Eight was a realistic expectations based on the moves the Broncos made during the offseason, specifically with Russell Wilson and specifically with their, supposed offensive, guru coordinator for a head coach in Nathaniel Hackett. And Hackett's already lost his job because of how bad this has gone. And I think quite a few of his staff members, assistants, go here in another week. But, they have no choice but to continue to invest in Russell Wilson and see if a different coach can make the difference and the Broncos can get going again.
I guess it's tough. You mentioned Nathaniel Hackett getting the boot, of course, recently back in December. You look at the Broncos and the colossal disappointment that they were in 2022. What would you say? I know it's tough to boil it down to one thing, but what would you, in your opinion, say would be the biggest detriment for the Broncos in terms of missing their expectations?
Well, it'd be on the offensive side and the disconnect between Hackett and Russell Wilson. Whose ever fault it was, they're number 32 in scoring, Chris. You don't get, I mean, they've been bad the last 5 years, and they finished between 22nd and 28th in scoring. To finish 32 after you get Russell Wilson, that's an abomination. And whether that was Hackett or whether that was Russell Wilson, I think it's probably not one thing, but many things, and it's both. The blame lies at the feet of both Russell Wilson and Hackett. That they just completely whiffed right there. The defense was okay. The defense was good. I don't think it was quite as good as everyone says it was because it didn't finish games. There was a couple games they could have finished and they didn't do it. They gave up scores late in games, and then they completely laid down against the Rams on Christmas Day. But the defense wasn't the problem so much as offense, and they got to do something there. And Greg Penner said that at his press conference to deal with the firing of Nathaniel Hackett. They need a leader, a strong leader who can affect the culture, bring a winning culture, and they got to get that offense straightened out. So definitely it was offense. I don't think Hackett, as it turned out, didn't have the right instincts for the job, didn't have the right personality for the job. I think he might have deferred too much to Russell Wilson, and Russell Wilson should not be deferred to going forward, not after this year. So they got to get a strong head coach who's strong on the offensive side.
Maybe we saw some flashes of that. I mean, maybe playing a little optimist here in that Chiefs game where Russell Wilson showed, I would say, more than a few flashes under new head coach, interim head coach, Jerry Rossberg. Can he carry that over into 2023?
That was the most professional operation we've seen on offense this year. The penalties were down. Bad penalty on Cortland. I think we all agree that pass interference call. But Russell looked good. It was a bad interception he threw, where he tried to throw it over Carlos Dunlap, who was up, and that's where Russ in the pocket at 5'11". That's a detriment, no doubt about it. But otherwise, he played, I thought, extremely well. He ran the ball. He ran just enough. He only ran 4 times. People talk about how much he ran. He only ran 4 times, but it was effective runs, and so it looked like he ran a little bit more. 2 of them were for touchdowns. So it did look like the Russell Wilson of Seattle, maybe for the first time this year. So yeah, I think maybe that's now they're heartened that if they get the right coach and the right system and the right scheme and funnel Russell Wilson into the scheme, into the boundaries, he's going to be an effective quarterback again. We'll see.
Fingers crossed. I guess maybe part of that could be on Jerry Rosburg, who seemed to have pretty good command in that Chiefs game. And we'll see, obviously, what happens in the finale against the Chargers as well. But do you think that Jerry Rosburg's firmly in the conversation about who could be the next Broncos head coach?
I don't think he's firmly in the conversation, but I do think he. I hope he gets an interview. I'm not sure he will, but I hope he does. I think what the thing that was impressive about Jerry Rosburg is how much he paid attention in what was a senior consultant role. I mean, he didn't come in here and just collect a paycheck and help out Hackett on game day with when to call a timeout and when to throw a challenge flag. He paid attention to the roster. He paid attention to the coaching staff. He fired 2 coaches. Which automatically puts people on edge, right? I mean, better shape up here. This isn't a substitute teacher where you can goof around. This is a guy who means business. And he changed play callers, went to Justin Outen, gave him a shot. So Kubiak could work directly with Russell Wilson during the game. He benched the rookie punt returner and kickoff returner, Montrell Washington, and inserted a much more dependable Kendall Hinton back there on returns. He reinserted Albert O at tight end, who did some nice things. I mean, that was a wasted talent on the bench all year. They wouldn't even give him a uniform on game day. And so those things, I think, all added up, and I think he got their attention. I think they played. It looked to me like they played with just a little bit of fear in them, that if they don't play, Jerry Rosburg's going to bench them the next week. So I thought it was good, and I do think Jerry Rosburg can be a head coach. I'd like for him to kind of cut down on his pontification at every press conference. Every press conference is like 22 minutes long, 25. We only need about 8. But Jerry, he's got a lot to say. He's got a lot on his mind, and he's not wasting this opportunity. All in all, he's done a nice job and kind of illustrated some things in this program that Penner and George Paton should pay attention to.
I guess when it comes to the coaching search, if Jerry Rosburg may or may not get an interview, obviously, even if he does, he would not be, I would assume, the favorite.
He's not going to get the job. The question is whether he gets an interview, and I think he deserves an interview. He will not get the job.
So then who would you label as some of the early potential candidates for that head coaching gig?
Well, there's a big 2, and then there's a solid number 3. The big 2 are Jim Harbaugh and Sean Payton. And I do think Penner is Greg Penner, who's conducting this search, by the way, with assistance from George, versus last year where George led the search. And, after he picked Hackett and you saw what happened, George got his wings clipped. And so Penner will lead it, and I think he'll go big with one of those 2. I'd be surprised if Harbaugh or Payton is not the next Broncos head coach. And the only reason why I think they won't be the head coach is if both those guys have concerns about Russell Wilson. and just this overall state of the team. The third guy would be Dan Quinn, who they interviewed last year. He actually finished second in the interview process last year. They should have brought him in for a second interview. They canceled it because they were blown away by Hackett. And that was a mistake, obviously. And, Dan Quinn had two really good years with the Atlanta Falcons, and has had two really good years as defensive coordinator for the Dallas Cowboys. So he's more than ready for the job again. Maybe a sleeper pick I've heard is maybe Mike Munchak. Keep an eye on. He, basically was out of football this year. He lives in the area. He moved here. One reason why he took the offensive line job here a few years ago is because he has family here, daughter and grandkids. That's maybe a name. And he's got experience. They're looking for experience after 3 straight first-time head coaches, Vance Joseph, Vic Fangio, and Nathaniel Hackett. They want someone who's been there, done that. And then you got to look at Jim Caldwell, Leslie Frazier, D'Amico Ryans, who doesn't have previous experience, but is a hot candidate as a defensive coordinator from the 49ers. I really like Ken Dorsey, the offensive coordinator from the Bills. But after he had that blow up that went viral in the coach's box after a loss earlier this year, he might have hurt himself there. But those are some of the names out there. But Harbaugh and Payton are definitely tied for first.
If you had to pick, who between those two, between Payton and Harbaugh, do you think Penner prefers?
I cannot, speak to that. I know there's a connection with Stanford, with Harbaugh and the Penners. The Penners, Kerry and Greg met at Georgetown as they got their undergraduate BA's degrees. And then they both went together to graduate school, to the Graduate School of Business at Stanford to get their MBAs. And so they have deep roots. And then they stayed in the area and raised their family. Atherton, California, I believe, is somewhere in the Bay Area. They're big Stanford boosters, and they have great attachment to Stanford. Condoleezza Rice is on the ownership group and is on the search committee. She was just on the Stanford football search committee. And so she has experience here. And she was there when Jim Harbaugh was the head coach for at least for 1 year anyway, at Stanford. She was Secretary of State for the first 3 years. But she has great attachment. So the connection kind of leads to Harbaugh. Another thing that leads to Harbaugh is he's the cleaner of the two. Sean Payton still has his rights held by the Saints for 4 years, 2023 and 2024. So the Saints would get compensation in return, and they're going to want a first-round draft pick. The Broncos right now have the 49ers first-round draft pick and no second-round pick. So they're hurting on draft capital to pull off that trade. They'd have to convince the Saints that a third-rounder and a player maybe is worth compensation for Sean Payton to get it done. So I'd give the edge to Harbaugh because he's cleaner. But that doesn't mean if Penner likes Payton better and Payton is more in on the Broncos than Harbaugh. See, that's the other thing. Which of those two is in on the Broncos? Which of those two believes the Broncos can turn it around? Because Penner will throw big money at the one that gets the job, and you got to make sure they're not taking the job for the money, that they're taking the job for the Denver Broncos. And so the interview process will determine that. But going in, logic says Harbaugh would have the slight edge.
I guess final big question here would be, do you expect any other major offseason shakeups? For example, you mentioned George Payton getting his wings clipped. Could he potentially have his job in jeopardy considering he was not hired by this ownership group?
I don't think so. But unless Sean Payton or Jim Harbaugh say, want their own GM, and I don't think they will. George Payton has a great reputation within the league, within the industry, with fellow executives, fellow GMs, fellow scouts, um, coaches. Everybody likes George, and he's good at his job. He works at it. He knows how to evaluate. He knows administratively how to handle the job. Now he's made some major decision errors um, on top of the that led to this season, and and he is getting appropriately paddled, if you will, by the new ownership. So I think George stays, but there is a chance that the new coach will want his own GM. It's going to be a different structure, Chris, and that the head coach Hackett's immediate boss was George Payton. That won't be the case here. Uh, Harbaugh or George or Sean Payton or Dan Quinn, their next direct boss will be Greg Penner. So they'll have equal standing within the organization, and it's possible that someone like Harbaugh or Sean Payton would have superior standing. So, but I think, having said all that, I think the Broncos will keep George Payton, and he'll have to. It's an ego check for George, but I think he'll be good in a collaborative kind of a co-role rather than that big boss role.
Well, seems like an offseason yet again that'll have quite a bit of change. And
I'm not happy about that, Chris. I'm not.
I know, Mike. We got to get you to Cabo at some point.
Yeah, I know. That'll be. That will be in a few years. I'm afraid. Okay. So this job's going to keep me going for a little while longer. That's for sure.
Well, we know you're always on top of it, but our 9 News Broncos insider, Mike Klis, as always, we appreciate a few minutes of your time, and thanks for joining us and letting us your expertise and insight.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Mike.